The Diablo 2 Sorceress is one of the most played classes in the game, mainly due to her high mobility with teleport, high AoE damage, and generally being the naturally angry ranged glass cannon of Diablo 2. The Sorceress is mostly gear independent as well in most of her builds, since her damage is mostly skill based rather than gear based. That said, with good gear she becomes immensely stronger since it can often remove mana as an issue and greatly improve her fire rates with various skills. Stat-wise, the Sorceress fits her role fairly well, with strength and vitality on the low end sitting at 10 each, but a reasonable 25 dexterity and 35 energy. This means that you're going to need to invest a few more levels early on to equip all but the most basic armors in each slot. As expected, the Sorceress also falls on the lower end of life growth, with only 1 life per level and 2 per point in vitality, but she excels at her mana growth with 2 per level and 2 per point in energy. As with most classes, her stamina is a flat 1 per level and 1 per vitality point. The Sorceress is also on the slower end for most animations, with the exception of cast speed of most spells, falling below average on block speed and tying for last in the faster hit recovery pool. That said, she shares the fastest cast crown with the Barbarian, oddly enough. But it is worth noting that the lightning and chain lightning spells use a different cast speed than other spells, which makes them a little bit slower but still spammable with the right equipment. With all that out of the way though, we have the meat and potatoes of the Sorceress, the spells. As expected, the Sorceress is an elemental powerhouse, with an entire tree dedicated to each of the 3 major elements: fire, ice, lightning. You know, those 3. With pros and cons to each tree, and a lot of synergies that incentivize choosing a primary element to focus on, though it is still possible to run dual element effectively, but triple is a little bit more complex than it used to be, in Classic at least. As with the other guides, for the sake of brevity, we will focus on the interesting spells in each tree while only briefly explaining the less noteworthy ones, and it is noting back on that triple elemental build, that is generally a lot more gear dependent than dual or single element. First off, we'll jump straight into the fire tree for you pyromancers out there. The theme of fire damage in Diablo is reliable and consistent high damage, but also highly resisted by enemies throughout the game, and the skills, for the most part, match this philosophy. On the left branch we have damage over time with Inferno, Blaze, and Firewall, Inferno being, well, useless due to a mix of issues that deserve a video of their own, but needless to say, it doesn't do near the damage you wish or that it displays or that you think it does, because of a few things that are perceived as glitches or bad design decisions. Next is Blaze and Firewall. They can do okay damage, but for the most part can be hard to aim for new players, since the trick is getting enemies to linger in the fire by leading them through it. And while their damage used to be amazing in earlier patches, they aren't quite up to par with other options nowadays. Blaze being the easier of the two to aim, where you can basically just run away from enemies setting them on fire, and Firewall doing more damage, but it's on a fixed line, so you have to cast it and then lead enemies down it. In the middle, we have the more explosive fire skills, Firebolt, Fireball, and Meteor. All 3 very strong damage spells, with Firebolt and Fireball being the easiest to use, and Meteor being a little bit more difficult due to the delay between casting and landing of the Meteor. But also, it's very strong if you can make it hit because it is massive damage. Unfortunately, it is on a casting delay though. Firebolt itself is actually kind of interesting since with synergies, it can turn into a significant damage source for only 2.5 mana per cast, making it easily spammable but only single target, while the Fireball is usually the workhorse of this due to being spammable, high damage, and AoE. So you don't have to deal with casting delays or anything like that, and it does a ton of damage. On the right-hand side, we have the utility skills. Warmth, which is a 1-point wonder that every sorceress should put at least a single point in for the nice passive mana regen. Enchant, which is generally only really used by melee sorceresses to boost attack rating, but is also the only spell that can be used to directly buff allies. It's also useful for a few other things, but that deserves a video of its own. And Hydra, which is essentially the sorceress equivalent of an assassin trap, where you drop it out and it will autonomously shoot at enemies around. The only reason they are fairly weak is because of the casting delay, but they are usable in a few builds, just not the fastest ever. It's kind of a trick up the sleeve kind of skill. And as we'll see with the other 2 trees, we have the Mastery down at the bottom. In this case, Fire Mastery provides a blanket boost to most forms of fire damage. Yes, even fire damage from melee attacks. There are a few exceptions to this, but they are very specific and very situational, and that's generally something you'll either go to a wiki or a specific video about the elemental masteries for. Next up, we have the Cold Tree, which is appropriately the opposite of the Fire Tree, with lower damage but slowing and freezing effects on every skill, and a bit less resisted than Fire but more resisted than Lightning. Though with this tree's Mastery skill, it makes up for that by basically reducing the resistances of enemies who are not cold immune. It's just that kind of effect. It is worth noting that Cold Mastery only works if the enemy is not immune, since unlike lower resistant Conviction, Cold Mastery cannot break these immunities, even at reduced efficiency. But as far as the skills, we can break the branches down into proper AoEs on the left, direct fire in the middle, and armors on the right. On the left, Blizzard and Orb are both popular skills in their own right, with Blizzard being a beast when fully invested in with synergies and everything, and Frozen Orb being more popular for being the choice of people who are picking Cold Tree as their secondary element, since it performs well without any synergy investment. And as far as Frost Nova, I generally recommend avoiding it. It's exceptionally expensive for what it does, and it doesn't deal much damage. It does cause an AoE chill, but if it caused a freeze, it would actually be useful. It just doesn't do that. In the middle, we have the Direct Fire, Ice Bolt, which chills and deals light damage, Ice Blast, which freezes and deals moderate damage, and Glacial Spike, which is essentially an ice fireball that freezes to boot. They aren't as high damage as their fire counterparts, and they're usually pretty dang expensive, but they are quite functional and can be spammed with enough mana management. Over on the right-hand side, we have the armors, Frozen Armor, Shiver Armor, and Chilling Armor. The first two deal with melee enemies, smacking them with ice effects or even damage for hitting you, kind of like Thorns, except it does its own damage rather than reflecting it. And finally, Chilling Armor being much the same, but for ranged attackers, shooting ice bolts out at them as punishment. It is worth noting, as with all of these skills, the cold effects will not affect enemies that are immune to cold, so no freezing and no chilling for enemies that are cold immune, unfortunately, so you can't rely on that against everything in the game. And last but not least is the most shocking of the trees, Lightning, but also the hardest to summarize, but let's go for it. On the right-hand side, we have utilities Telekinesis that lets you pick up garbage, deal a pinch of damage and knockback, or activate things like waypoints, doors, etc. from a distance. Next is Teleport, which lets you move yourself to a distant location. It does what it says on the tin, but more points do make it cheaper at least. And number 3, Energy Shield. Use your mana to take some damage for you. It's a useful skill, but a bit on the complicated end of things for new players to grasp due to how it works in conjunction with resistances and other kinds of damage reducing effects, and when used improperly, it can just drop your mana to 0 extremely fast with no real benefit. So I suppose that's another skill probably to throw on the dedicated video list. The rest of the Lightning Tree, aside from the Mastery, are damage skills of various types, Mastery itself helping this by boosting damages. It is worth noting that synergies do not increase the minimum damage of the 1 to X damage skills like Lightning or Chain Lightning, but Mastery does. So let's of course actually start with those since they're on the tip of our tongue. Chain Lightning jumps between targets, damaging all of them, which is handy for dealing with spread out swarms of enemies, where Lightning is cheaper and damages all enemies in a straight line, more like Bone Spear, kind of piercing through them and ignoring the rest of that. There are pros and cons to each of them, and it really depends on the enemy positions as to which is going to be better in a given situation. However, if you're investing in one, chances are you are investing in the other for the synergy effects. Next up is Charged Bolt. Sitting quietly there at the top, this spell may not hit stunningly high damage numbers per bolt, but like the Amazon's Charged Strike, multiple bolts can hit a single target, allowing the damage to stack up very quickly when used properly, especially considering how easily spammed the skill is. You can even just drop an entire blanket of it down on a field. While it's not in as much of favor as it used to be, the Charged Boltress was a quirky semi-common build in some older patches for good reason. Of course, next up, we'll skip to the middle left, because we can't kind of stay on a pattern here, but anyway, Nova. It's pretty much just like Frost Nova, but actually effective since it deals reasonable damage, and is fairly spammable as long as you have the massive mana pool necessary to sustain it. A common speedrunning attack choice in some circles, it does some work, but is generally disregarded in favor of the easier to use Lightning and Chain Lightning for those of you who are actually going through the game in a normal fashion. Finally, the two we do damage, but we're also support skills. Thunderstorm, which causes bolts of lightning to come down intermittently from the sky around you, auto-targeting nearby enemies. If there was a way to make them come down faster, it would be a lot better, but due to the slow speed, it's relegated to being a novelty mostly. And the final skill, Static Field, is probably one of the most well-known Sorceress skills outside of Frozen Orb, since this is the skill that almost everyone puts a point into, and usually just 1 point because, well, the only improvement beyond there is the radius, and you can get that from plus skills. So what does this skill do that everyone uses it for? Well, it deals damage equal to a % of the enemy's life is what it does. Basically serving as a controllable, albeit lightning damage base, so it is able to be resisted by lightning resistances, crushing blow effect, making it exceptional for trimming down enemy life. It is worth noting that there is a limit to how low it can take life, on Hell especially, which is a limit of 50%. So you may get different mileage, but even in Hell, 50% of an enemy's life gone in a second or two is amazing. The nice thing about the lightning tree as well is that it's the least resisted of the primary 3 elements, and as such is ran into a little bit less often, but is also, whenever you do run into lightning immunities in Hell, it is much easier to break with conviction or lower resist whenever you do run into it, letting you safely traverse more areas without as many worries about immunities as you do with the other 2 trees. This is why it is often used for Magic Find. It's a toss-up usually between lightning or cold whenever you're doing that. Fire is generally for specific boss kills. Generally speaking, while each of the trees is strong in its own right, it is recommended to choose a primary element and sometimes a secondary, and just avoid those enemies that are immune to you whenever it comes up, unless you have the mercenary power or allies to handle the threat. Spreading into a tri-elemental sorceress, especially without high-end gear, will be a trial of patience for sure, and I do not recommend it to novice or even moderately skilled players, because you will run into the issue of just not doing enough damage because you have spread yourself too thin, especially if you do not have the plus skills to back it up. But anyway, that is the basic rundown of the Sorceress, and as always, if you have any questions, mention them down below and I'll do my best to answer them, or even if it's a specific enough question, make a video concerning it or answer it in one of the skill-specific videos. Or I can possibly direct you to the appropriate resources if it's something that I am not personally extremely versed on. The Sorceress is one of the strongest classes for doing Magic Find or rushing or any of that for sure, but it does come at the cost of being, well, more resisted in some areas, and living a bit more of a fragile life where you have to get better at positioning and juking the enemies, which is generally reserved for more experienced players. All that said, remember to keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. And I will see you guys next time on another Diablo 2 video.